All right, so another type of factoring. Just if you hear banging in the background, I'm sorry. It's got some work going on at my house, but so perfect squares. Perfect square trinomial is another kind of factoring. We still, take out what's in common, figure out our signs, like all that stays the same, and then this is another kind of factoring. And it can look one of two ways, and so one of the ways that it can look is like the first kind of factoring that we did, where there was no number in the front. And so I don't want to look at it any differently than I did on those other ones. So I would, I have x and x. What are the signs? The last time sign's positive. That means the signs are the same. Use the sign of the other term, so it's plus and plus. And then it's like, okay, what times what is 36? Well, let's see, 18 times 2, 36 times 1, 9 times 4, 6 times 6. So we would consider like all of those. I don't think there's another one. But which one of those makes a 12? So they're identical. So that's why we call it a perfect square, because it's x plus 6 squared would be like the answer. You need to write it like that. Okay, so I think it's easy enough to just like what times what, is 36, and then which one makes it 12. Really it does involve square roots. So if you notice that the number at the end has a square root, what's the square root of 36? 6. 6 plus 6 is 12. That's a shorter way to kind of get at it, but it doesn't mean that that's the answer. Because if I change the 12 to a 13, the 9 and the 4 are what I use. So just don't automatically go, oh, square root, that's the answer. There's other ways that the numbers can work out. That's just one of the possibilities. But if it's one that you look at first and it happens to work, fantastic. Just don't always just assume. You got to double check. Oh yeah, 6 plus 6 is 12, like, so I'm good. Okay. So the other way the problem could look is when there's a number in the front. And when there's a number in the front, it makes the problems much more challenging to do. So we always want to check, is it a perfect square trinomial, before we go into, and you haven't learned this yet, it'll be what we do tomorrow, before we figure out like, well, there's a number in the front, so, and that changes everything. It's definitely the most difficult kind of factoring. So if we can determine perfect square, much easier. Okay, so when there's a number in the front, first, is there anything in common? I always want to check for that. Well, I could divide by 4 with the 4 and the 20, but not with the 25, so there's not a 4 in common. I could divide by 5 with 25 and 20, but not with 4. So nothing's in common. All right, so then I want to check, is it a perfect square? So I've got 3 kind of, or maybe 2 kind of things, but can you do the square root of the first and the third term? Okay, so I can do the square root of 4 is 2. And I can do the square root of 5, the square root of 25 is 5. Okay, so I'm part of the way there. Okay. So if I say yes to that, then there's another question. when you multiply the square roots and times 2, does that equal the middle term? It's always times 2. Okay, whatever the numbers are for the square roots, it's always times 2. So if I do 2 times 5 equals 10, and times 2 is 20, that is the middle term, so I'm good. Okay, and so what that means is, what are the signs? The last term's positive, the signs are the same. The middle one's negative, so I do negative. And then I'm still going to have an x and an x to make x squared. I use the square roots. Okay, but you got to check that first, because it is possible, like, because really, when we come back to this first one, what times what is 36? I've got these 4 different ways to make 36. So if I put if I put 18 and 2 right there, that makes 36. It just doesn't make 12. So I can put different numbers in those spots that will still make 36. I just have to pick the ones that will also make a 12, so when I multiply it out, I'm good. So I could put a 4 and a 1 where the 2's are, and I will still get 4 at the beginning. And the 5 and the 5, I will still get 25 at the end. But when I put the 4 and the 1 there, I will not get 20. So there's more, just because you can do the square root of 4 and you can do the square root of 25, it doesn't mean 100% of the time it's going to work. A very high percentage of the time it's going to work, but it doesn't mean that will always. So you need to do that check on the second part. Multiply the square roots together and times 2. And if it equals the middle, then you're good. If it doesn't, then you'd have to go to this kind of factoring that we're going to learn about tomorrow. Okay, so all your problems today, you still could have, let's see. Well, let me, I'll do this. So you could still have a problem like this. Is there anything in common? Yes, there's a 2. Okay, and so then, all right, I got to factor. Signs are the same because the last one's positive, and then because the middle one's positive, that's what I use. X and X, and maybe you remember, you go, oh, square root of 16 is 4. Is 4 plus 4 8? Yeah. So you still may have, or you probably will have at least once, a number in common, and then it's a perfect square. Okay, so don't just assume that everything's going to be like square roots. Just be careful of, just like the last difference of squares one, so if you look at this one, like, oh, square root of 4 is 2, square root of 16 is 4. If I multiply them together and times 2, oh, it equals 16. So you might think, hey, it's a perfect square, and like you go, but you forgot to do something. Is there something in common? Yeah, I can divide all of those by 4. And so when I go here, signs are the same. Signs are always the same on a perfect square, by the way. but they'll be minus, and it's 2 times 2. So if you did this part like over here, you'll get an answer that will be correct, just not all the way correct. So what do I mean by all the way correct? So let's say you had the fraction 4/8 and you said, oh that's loud. I can divide by 2. Well, that's not wrong. It's just not all the way right. So if you did this part over here, you would get an answer that is factored. It just wouldn't be all the way factored. Okay, so always get in the habit, especially when you see a number in the front, that is there something in common first? Square roots are second, like when you check for square roots. Okay. All right, so that should give you what you need for today's assignment, and then we'll do the hard kind tomorrow. All right, have a good rest of your day, guys. See you tomorrow.